before 2019 and before 2020, you were seeing in the news all of these movements, whether it was like, Catalan or Scotland, Brexit, Hong Kong, and I mean, just really a worldwide phenomenon. This isn't going to go anywhere. Like those things don't just disappear. You may be able to submerge it, you may be able to get people distracted towards something else, but ultimately it's going to boil over. And I don't know. I feel like I almost want to say we haven't seen anything yet.
Happy Monday, everyone. It's Darren again. So today we have the second half of my interview with Jeremy Zogby from a few weeks ago. In the first half of the interview, I asked him about political polling and election forecasting in general, and some questions about the general state of the country. In the second half of the interview, we really focus in on the question of secessionist sentiment in the country. So we really dive into exactly what some of these surveys say, and we talk about how we should interpret these results. And we talk specifically about some of the wording of some of the questions that was given, the timing of some of the polls, and how we can maybe compare different types of polling that were done. So it's a really interesting conversation. Hope you enjoy this second half of the interview.
Unless I'm misunderstanding you, I think I would agree that it's not going to happen. I don't think people are going to tone it down. I think. Well, I guess why don't we just get into what is the likelihood of some kind of secession happening?
Okay, we can go that direction.
What do you think?
Let me address you asked if you were misinterpreting. I'll clarify a little bit. I was not saying that people were not capable of bringing the temperature down or toning down the rhetoric or having some amount of empathy. I actually think that's possible. So it wasn't that I was saying that that's not going to happen. The point that I was making was that even if we're really successful at that, even if we really are successful at bringing the temperature down, that's not going to bridge the gaps and divides in people's worldviews. So no, I think it's possible to bring everything down. I just don't think that's going to be a long-term.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to be a long-term solution. I think there's still going to be these fundamental divisions that are still going to be around, even if the temperature is brought down. That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
As far as
yeah.
So the likelihood of secession. I think we only have another one or two presidential elections left in us that we can have this kind of discord. 2016 was bad, and then 2020 was even worse. What's going to happen in 24? Then what's going to happen in 28? I think it's entirely possible within 10 years that there's some form of dissolution or separation or secession. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility at all.
Totally not, because it's always been there. I mean, the country was born in declaring independence, and there have been states that have threatened even before the Civil War. My understanding is that Massachusetts threatened to leave the Union very early on. I know there were other states that just doesn't come to mind right off the top of my head, but I mean, you have people talking about it in your state. You have people talking about it, very serious about it in Texas, very serious about it in New Hampshire. There's there's all kinds of movements in various states. But then there's also this other dynamic of it, of like, say, counties in Virginia saying we're going and moving over to West Virginia. That's been a recent thing, and that's come back up in the news. I think Oregon recently, there was some news about that, right? And
yeah, Greater Idaho.
yep. And so like, there's secession and or declaring independence, whatever you want to call it, and then there are things that also border it, and what I just discussed of redrawing, taking aspects of one state and going into another, kind of related to that, and then nullification, or just a state, like look at Ron DeSantis, look at Governor Abbott, where you're talking about issuing vaccine passports. Well, we're going to ban them. You're talking about everybody should. Now, this isn't necessarily nullification, but it's acting like in the style of nullifying what the federal government is saying, and I think COVID is really going to express a lot of this, because you have a nation where half of the people, basically, according to the CDC data, are vaccinated, and the other half aren't. Now, the media likes to turn this into a Trump-Biden thing, and that's a very one-dimensional way of looking at it. We've been polling on this a lot, and the African Americans, 40% we've seen in polls had unfavorable views towards the COVID-19 vaccine. Mothers with children were another high group. Hispanics, young people basically saying we don't need it. So it's beyond Democrat, Republican, and the reason why that ties in is because if you think about it, what they're calling medical freedom is essentially an issue of individual sovereignty. So, now we're getting into state sovereignty, county sovereignty, and then now we're getting into individual sovereignty, where people, I think large parts of the population are already checking out of the system and will continue to check out of the system.
So, as a California independence movement activist, I'm interested in some of the survey research you've done over, I think, the past 2 or 3 years on kind of measuring the depth of support for this. Could you describe some of the results that you've uncovered, as well as some other surveys that have been taken? And in particular, I'm thinking here of the two most recent Bright Line Watch survey waves. There's number 14 in January, February of this year, and then number 15 reported just last month.
So I'll show you where we fit into the mix. I'm going back to August of 2018, and this was a repeat from a question in 2017, which showed basically the same results. So I'll give you the 2018. We asked in a poll on political topics regarding the nature of government. The question was a statement A or B, which one comes closer to your view? And the first statement is, if a majority of residents within a given state prefer to have the final say over their destiny without the control of Washington, D.C., then let them have it. It's their right. That's somewhere between secession and nullification. That's statement A. Statement B, if residents within a given state were to take such a drastic measure and secede from the U.S., the federal government would be justified sending in the military to prevent secession from taking place. That's statement B. Overall, you've got 39% who agree with the statement A, which again I'll make clear is somewhere between nullification and secession. I think the reason I didn't ask flat out secession was because it was around that time it's kind of felt a little felt a little controversial, and I wanted to soften it to see how many people would get on board. And so you've got 39% who have that let's just call it the 10th Amendment outlook, states having rights to have control over their own destiny, and 32% agreeing with the, I guess you could say, the more Lincoln stance of if states are going too much in their own direction of basically declaring independence, we're sending in the military. Now, I updated the question, and this was June of 2020, and so I just flat out asked about secession, and same idea here. Statement A, B. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view? Statement A: states seceding from the Union is illegal, and any attempt to do so should be put down by military intervention. That's the ghost of Lincoln. Statement B: states have a legal right to declare independence from the federal government and should not have to face military intervention. That's the ghost of Jefferson. And overall, 39% agree that it's illegal. Secession is illegal and should be put down, and 36% say that it's legal. But keep in mind that given this is a poll of 1,000 likely voters, the margin of error is plus or minus 3%. So in our answer, which is just a 3 percentage point difference, that's the margin of error. I'm just going to tell you that they're dead split.
It's a statistical tie, yeah.
Right? I mean, who cares if one wins 2%, or you've got basically, and of course the rest that remain sure are a 25%, which is significant, which would obviously help too. I don't know. Maybe if you were theoretically to get a way to press those individuals, I wouldn't be surprised that we still end up with a split vote. And that, in other words, 25% isn't necessarily going to largely go one way or the other. But, that's just hypothetical.
I think I raised this with you earlier in a question. There's kind of two aspects to the type of sentiment that you're seeking. There's the issue of whether people believe that states have this right, or whether they believe that groups of people have this right, and whether they themselves actively want to be involved in this kind of action. In other words, you're really asking them, suppose Texas decides that it no longer wants to be in the Union, and most of the vast majority of people in Texas would like to leave. Do they have the right to do that? That's one thing to ask somebody. Then it's another very different thing to ask them, do you want to leave? Like, do you want your state to get out? Those are different questions, but I think that just asking the fact that do you think that states have the right, I think those are still remarkable numbers, even given that wording.
Yeah. I didn't want to ask whether people were down with it in their state, because I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I might do it. I don't see why I shouldn't do it. But I guess the logic behind it was, I think most people, especially when I did this poll, were they wouldn't really. In other words, most people live in states where that's not happening, and even where it is happening, it's by far the minority, right? There is a movement in California. It's been around, but it's not mainstream. Texas, I don't believe it's mainstream. I think it's bigger in Texas, but it's not mainstream. So I feel like going into that kind of question, it's already like, kind of like a subculture. But to get people to ask where they stand philosophically on it, or values wise, like you're suggesting, speaks volumes. I would love to poll I would love for somebody to call us up and say, hey, do Texas. I don't even know. I couldn't even begin to project what that would look like. But I think that would be fascinating. I think it would be fascinating to find out in California.
Well, if I had $10,000 laying around, then I.
Well, and hey, what's going on with the recall?
Oh,
I mean, I'm following it, but I mean, hey, it's about split right now.
the polling on the recall, yes or no?
Yeah, two polls came out in the last 2 weeks. So Emerson College, which I'm familiar with, they've been good over the years. They had it 48% said keep. Well, we'll keep it like we'll put that way. Said keep Newsom. 43% said recall. The follow-up question of who should replace him. Larry Elder, 16%. I think the next it was either Cox or Falconer. They didn't even get double digit. They were like at 8%. So maybe even 6. So Elder almost had a double digit lead. Okay, so that was July 19th and 20th and released shortly after that. Then Berkeley came out with a poll on the 27th of July, just days ago, and the gap narrowed. And so 50% said keep Newsom, 47% said recall, get rid of Newsom. Larry Elder, again the favorite, with 18%.
We'll see.
What can happen between now and September 14th?
I would be very surprised if he's recalled. Although I had not heard those numbers before.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you this? Because I got to talk to a Californian about this. So right now the polls are split, and Emerson's reputable. I'm not too familiar with Berkeley, but obviously Berkeley's a world-class institution. Not familiar with their polling, but basically mirrors Emerson, which is a reputable poll. It's split. You've got a month and a half. Mind you, Newsom has very poor ratings. He does not break 50% on his favorable. His job in handling COVID, the drought, the wildfires, and homelessness all are below 50%. What if there's a major wildfire that reaches LA? What if there's an explosion of homelessness? Because my understanding is the moratorium on eviction was not renewed.
That would definitely be troublesome for him. Yes, he's not the most popular. I think there are, obviously, when you see numbers like 50 to 47, there are a lot of Democrats who are saying they're in favor of the recall. I think that's because they're not necessarily happy with some of the things that he's done, but I don't think they would be in favor of a Republican taking office. One of the strange things about the recall is that if the recall is succeeds, if it's yes, my understanding is that whoever gets the most votes in the secondary question becomes governor, no matter what percentage they get. I mean, and if it's split among this large number of candidates, if the top vote getter gets 16%, I mean, what kind of, that just seems nuts to me. Like, that somebody who gets 16% of the vote could wind up being governor. I don't know if people realize that when they're considering their vote.
Yeah.
I don't really like this. I don't really like the setup for the recall. I think if there's going to be a recall, then the secondary vote on a replacement should be some kind of runoff, or you should have to have a certain kind of minimum percentage. because this idea of somebody sneaking into the governors with less than 20% of the vote, it just doesn't seem to me like it's very democratic. But if the numbers you're saying are accurate, then it's
I could see that.
It's a possibility.
Newsom's in trouble. He's against the ropes right now. It's just whether or not he can be finished off. And a lot of that is out of his power. A lot of that is literally storm clouds gathering.
We were talking about the wording of the questions, getting back to some of the polling on secession. When you ask a question, even if you were to ask outright, like, would you support your state seceding? There's something in voting, I know I've heard of expressive voting, which is basically saying people vote as a way to express an identity. Is there a similar type of thing in poll response where, if you ask me, if a pollster calls me up or I'm doing an internet survey and they say, do I support secession? I'm going to answer yes. I mean, because I'm pretty committed. I've started a podcast. But I could see somebody who answers yes when they think, well, I kind of thought of it before and maybe I'm open to it. And I don't really know what I think, but I'm open to it enough that I'll say yes. And then maybe there's somebody who hasn't really thought about it at all, but when they hear the question or they hear the issue, it just strikes them in a certain way, and that's their just gut reaction is yes. I mean, those seem like they're three very different types of individuals responding to that who are all kind of giving the same answer. Is there a way to tease out those differences or?
Absolutely. I know exactly. That's a standard thing in polling is a Likert scale or a scale question. How much would you support? Strongly support, somewhat unsupport, strongly unsupport, and not sure, obviously, as an option. And so when you report, you combine the strong and the somewhats on both sides. And if you see a great intent, this is why you do it, to see what is the distribution of the intensity. Where let's just say we had 50-50 to keep it simple, where we did that scale of options and combining the strongly support and somewhat support secession at 50%. Let's say you had 60% who said strongly and 40 who said somewhat. So now you've got this weight towards really strong, who've got this momentum in the support camp. And just imagine what dynamic that can play in the social conversation, and the same thing on the other side. But I mean, at the end of the day, they said they support it, so you combine them together, but you read where that intensity falls into it.
What did you make of the most recent, the Brightline Watch, the number 15? I was not expecting the numbers. I mean, I guess I'm not surprised, but I still wasn't expecting the scale of the numbers that they reported.
Could you refer? I'm pretty sure I caught it. Was that the one that was at about 50%?
So this was the most recent one, number 15 in June 2021, so just a couple months ago. And let me bring up they had a map here. So the overall, well, let me give you the percentages for different regions. In the South, overall was 44%. The Northeast, 34%. The Heartland, which is like the Midwest and Rust Belt, 30%. Mountain, 32%, and the Pacific, 39%. And overall number was 37%. They said, in the entire country.
Yeah. And then what's the exact framing of the question?
So it was phrased kind of interestingly. So what they did was they went a little bit more towards the direction of what you were saying about asking a more direct question.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying, do you think states have the right, but they were actually saying, are you down with it? So the wording is that they took all the different states in the union and they kind of grouped them into 5 geographic regions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, Alaska. They kind of put those together in the Pacific. There was, the South all the way from Texas to Virginia and so on. The Midwest, the Northeast, and then the mountain states. So 5 regions. And then what they would ask is, depending upon which state you were in, here's the wording that they used. Quote, would you support or oppose your state, in brackets, so that's where they would place the state of the person, seceding from the United States to join a new union with, bracket, and then they list the other states. So if they contacted somebody in California, the wording would be, would you support or oppose California seceding from the U.S. to join a new union with Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, and Alaska? So a pretty direct question on secession. Not do you think they have the right, but pretty direct.
Yeah.
If you were someone in, let's say, Arizona, then they would say, the question would be, would you support or oppose Arizona seceding from the U.S. to join a new union with Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Nevada, and Mexico?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have some issues with some of the groupings. I don't know exactly how relevant it is to kind of just lump all of these states together. But I think it's a relatively valid question to ask the way that they worded it. And especially given that they pretty much asked the same question 6 months ago. So any issues that I would have or that somebody might have with the particular wording of it,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's still useful because you can measure it over time. You can see whether it's increasing or decreasing.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. And they saw that there was a dramatic increase from 6 months ago, which they were surprised by because they had this idea, I don't know from where, that that Biden was going to be super successful at uniting people and toning down the temperature and really bringing the country together. And they thought now that he's in the White House, things are going to settle down, and they expected a decrease in the numbers, and they saw just the opposite.
Yeah.
And they were really surprised by it.
What was the overall 6 months ago?
Okay, the overall 6 months ago. Okay, so in the report 6 months ago, they say, quote, overall 29% of respondents supported the dissolution of the country into like-minded regions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
So it increased from 29% in the entire country to 37%, an 8-point increase.
Yeah.
That's huge.
So, and let me just go back to what I have here. Okay, so here's what's amazing about that. Well, first off, on this notion that Biden was going to tone everything down and help to heal everything, no question about it. Biden has this aura of himself of like very, very presidential. Like he was by far lined up with all the other candidates the most presidential. And it's kind of like Barack Obama in a sense, not as electric as Obama, but that thing about him that he walks on the stage and the way he carries himself and the way he can deliver himself is very presidential, but you've got to see beyond the style. You've got to go for the substance. Don't go by what they say, go by what they do. And I guess there's just a large portion of the population that maybe won't get away from that. But anyway, regardless of that, look at the numbers in the polls that we've all talked about. So I had my question back in 2018 that didn't even outright say secession. It flirted with secession, right? Like I said, it was somewhere between nullification and secession. And that was the plurality that received 39% versus 36% that were against it, and anything like that should have a military intervention. Then I got more direct in 2020, and 39% said no, quash it, it's a rebellion. 36% said they have a legal right. And now you're talking 39% are in favor of an actionable, a question that's actionable. It's not just the
Right.
philosophical value or where you stand. It's like, here's a scenario. But isn't it amazing that the numbers are within a few points of each other? Whether you ask it values wise, whether you flirt with the issue or whether you go into it, that tells me right there that that sentiment is deeply embedded in us. And of course, that would make a lot of sense, because if we claim to have a a higher document, a document that's like, I'm looking for the terminology, like divine, it's the Declaration of Independence. So it really shouldn't surprise anybody.
Yeah, those are very consistent numbers, I think, is the thing to take away from it. It's not just one poll. It's, those two consecutive polls that they did combined with the results that you got with different wordings. That's just very consistent across time. I mean, I could also mention there's the Reuters Ipsos poll. This is just specific to California. That was in early 2017. But yeah, and I think it is remarkable that they were able to maintain that same number around 39%, even with the change in the wording, with the more actionable language in the statement.
Yeah.
That they still maintain. It would be possible to think that with the stronger language, making it more actionable, that there would be a little bit of decrease there, because there's some people that think that there's a legal right, but I'm not. But apparently, when you change it to make it a more strong language, the support is still there.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, you're asking somebody what they think about secession, and how many people in the public are going to say, well, philosophically, I agree with it, but I don't ever want to see it happen in this country. No, I mean, if you agree with it and you say that it's morally right, it's legally right, then you're going to support it. Now, maybe some of the people who are skirting on the issue, those are the people that fall into the not sure category. I think they're internalizing. They're saying to themselves, well, it doesn't bother me to hear about the word, but I'm not really sure what I think today. Check back with me in 3 to 5 years, right? So it's just testament that we see that number over a third, hanging out around 40%. It keeps popping up. That's validation to me that the sentiment is strong.
Yeah, and as you said, it shouldn't be surprising historically, because the founding document is the Declaration of Independence. There's a book that I was going to recommend to you if you haven't heard of it. Mm-hmm. It's called Break It Up.
Okay, I have not.
Have you?
I have not.
You've not heard of it.
No.
So it's I'm in the middle of reading it right now. I'm about halfway through, and it's written by I believe he has a history background. It's basically a history book, but it goes over the history of secessionist thought throughout the entire history of the country. And one of the things that I didn't realize is the idea that the country is what's the word for it that Lincoln would use?
Indivisible
is the word. Yeah, the idea that the nation is indivisible and can never be changed or broken apart in some way, that really wasn't a widespread or commonly accepted notion until Abraham Lincoln. That there was actually a really strong strain of thought among a lot of the founding fathers and the people who started the country, that we came together as this federation of states, but 20, 30 years from now, maybe some of the states in the West will break off and they'll do their own thing. And it was a lot more fluid. And he really quotes he quotes their writings. I mean, they said things that they wrote. And it's really interesting that this is it's not something it didn't originate in the Civil War. I think we have a idea that this is something that came about just out of slavery in the Civil War.
Yeah, no.
But it really, he talks about actually there were abolitionists who wanted to secede because they viewed remaining in the Union with slavery as immoral, and they thought that seceding from a country that tolerated slavery was the morally right thing to do.
Yeah, in my neck of the woods, which is along the Erie Canal, we had what was called the Burned Over District. And the abolitionists came out of that. A lot of movements came out of that. But there was one movement in particular where you had utopian societies and groups that altogether just dropped out. Nathaniel Horn was not Nathaniel Hawthorne, sorry, was a part of that. We had the Oneida community, not the Indians, but John Humphrey Noyes. We had all these kind of think about the Mormons. I mean, they weren't secessionists, but they wanted government off their back, and they went out west. They were founded in upstate New York. So I mean, that was on the religious side where they really just wanted to create their own society away from what was going on, and have their own little sovereignty among themselves. And yeah, I mean, there were several states that threatened to secede long before this became an issue in the 50s leading up to the Civil War. You had I mean, going back to the founding fathers, like you're talking about the notion of the country being indivisible. No, I mean, the United States fought a revolution against a highly centralized authority that it was a king that had a national bank that could issue currency and wage war whenever it wanted to. And then when they need to make up for the money, they could tax the colonists without representation. And so it just seems kind of crazy to think that after having fought a revolution against that the nation would then recreate that. Although Alexander Hamilton essentially wanted to do that. But the first 70 years of the nation's history was what they called Jeffersonian democracy. And it was based on that limited government off our back, a not a central government, because anytime you get a central government, they're just going to take away your rights and find ways to bypass your rights. And Lincoln really brought about. Lincoln, I see him as the disciple of Hamilton. He was the ghost of Hamilton. He instituted the Hamiltonian system, where you now move towards further centralization, and of course that went into the next level with the progressive movement and just the 20th century in general. Whether it's Democrats or Republicans, just more scope and size of the government. And here we are at a point where, I mean, you have power players that are talking about global government. The Davos crowd, that's no secret. Henry Kissinger, Klaus Schwab, people who want some, form of quasi global government and global citizenry. And so we're at this interesting crossroads where we have this bloated central government at the national level. But do we continue with that? Do we go more towards global governance, or do we become more local and regional? And my question is, what has the most skin in the game? That's my question.
Yeah, my issue is not so much with the size of the federal government. I think I speak for a lot of people in California independence. It's that we feel that we don't have any say.
Mm-hmm.
That our voice doesn't really matter because we have two senators. We have almost 1/8 of the population. We have two senators out of 100. We have, we don't affect national elections. Pretty much, Washington, D.C. politicians come here just to get money. They come here to raise money, and that's it. Then they go. The East Coast seems, I don't know, maybe it's hard to describe for somebody that lives on the East Coast most of their life. But I've lived in California almost all my life, and when I didn't live in California, I was in Oregon or New Mexico, which are pretty much in the West. But there's a big geographic divide. I don't feel much connection to people on the East Coast. I mean, maybe in a general cultural sense, but it feels like it's a long way away. It feels like it's a great distance that separates me. Even liberal or progressive or Democratic people in New York and New England that may vote the same, even though they vote the same, they still feel distant. They feel like that they have different issues and different needs, and it just feels like we're so far removed here that we're big enough of an economy and big enough of a cultural place that we can exert more local control over how we run our affairs. So that's more what's important, I think, to a lot of people here. Is that we don't really feel that we have control over decisions that are made on our behalf. Yeah.
I mean, well, could that essentially be, and I mean, this is kind of how I kind of interpret that, is Californians are an independent people, right? There's really no other state in the union, generally speaking, where people. Now I know California is very diverse between the north, the south, the coast, and the mountains. But what we know of California, right? Especially the coastal, Californians are a unique people, and I don't know. Do you think maybe they've just had it with it being told, what they can and can't do, given all of the wealth in that state, given all of the influence in that state, they've just kind of they've had it with Washington D.C. or is it? I mean, I feel like that's just another way of stating what you said.
No, that's exactly it. Well, especially the last year and a half, I identify more as a Californian than an American. Just as far as my identity, I always kind of felt that way. But you're an American citizen, so I kind of gave deference to my American identity. But there's a very strong cultural identity in California that's very specific to California. And a lot of people do identify as Californians even more than they would identify as Americans.
Yeah.
In the same way that a lot of Scottish would identify as Scottish first, and members of the UK second, or Catalonians think of themselves as Catalonians first, and Spanish citizens second. It's very similar dynamic.
Yeah, and that's the next level of this conversation is we've kind of kept it entirely within the bounds of the states, but this is also a global phenomenon. And just to give you an analogy, remember before COVID, 2020 was shaping up to be the year of the protest because 2019 was just, people were taken to the streets everywhere. I mean, I remember in Santiago and Beirut and Hong Kong. I'm sure there were definitely other cities. Those are the ones that come to mind. But then COVID hit, and then there were lockdowns all over the world, and so people were just pushed inside, and all that pent up energy, and then it just came right back, and it's still going on. And the one I forgot was Paris and the yellow vests.
Yellow vests.
Yep. And so now all of that pent up energy has been refocused, and maybe it has to do with lockdowns, or maybe it has to do with vaccine passports or whatever. But if you think about it, there's that scientific law that says that energy doesn't disappear, it dissipates. Well, maybe you could say there's something similar in terms of when people get really angry, and even if you force them inside, the anger is going to shift. It's going to let out at some point. And so what I'm getting at is before 2019 and before 2020, you were seeing in the news all of these movements, whether it was like Catalan or Scotland, Brexit. If they were talking about it in France, they were talking about it in Italy, Hong Kong, and I mean, just really a worldwide phenomenon. This isn't going to go anywhere. Like those things don't just disappear. You may be able to submerge it. You may be able to get people distracted towards something else, but ultimately, it's going to boil over. And I don't know. I feel like I almost want to say we haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah, I think this is just the beginning. The book, by the way, is by Richard Kreitner. It's a Kreitner.
Yeah, I will definitely look at that.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. We've gone quite a while here. Why don't do you have any closing remarks or thoughts? And then also let people know where they can find out more about you, or where they can find the podcast and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an analyst, and so I'm not an activist. I just try to understand what's going on. I try to look at things objectively, and I feel like I've done a good job. I haven't participated in national elections since 2012. I think I've done a good job at being objective and nonpartisan. And so I just want to bring up something I talked about was questioning party allegiance. I would just, ask your listeners to think about that, and they probably already do. I mean, if they're listening to this kind of stuff, but just think about that. Like, why should we be beholden to any party? This country was founded on free agency. I have to mention the quote in Jefferson's tomb. He says, I swear on the altar of humanity that I reject all forms of tyranny of the mind. And when I think of tyranny of the mind, and when I think of Washington's farewell address of warning Americans about political factions, I think about parties. I think about political parties, and I think about their cultish nature. They're truly cults. So that aside, if you like what you heard and the kind of analysis that I give, and maybe what I think is a unique viewpoint, you can check me out on a weekly podcast, the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. Let me just say real quickly, my dad and we cut our first episode. We did exactly what it was called, Unscripted. We met at the studio. We cut one episode. No edits. The guy said, you know what, this is good to go. And so we said, all right, real and unscripted. So every week I get together with my dad, and I have no idea what he's going to talk about. I usually get in my mind what I think he's going to talk about. And in most cases, I'm wrong. And he just goes off, and it's total improvisation. And of course, my dad's been doing this for 40 years. But we definitely have different viewpoints of the world, and you can get, I guess, kind of what would more or less be the establishment view and the non-establishment view, but we're always respectful, and there's always love, and we just try to model how discourse should play out, no matter, and it'll be clear to the viewers how much we disagree with each other. We never let it affect our relationship. And so it's on Apple, it's on Stitcher, it's on SoundCloud. You can go to our website, www.johnzogbystrategies.com. You can find it there. And I would just ask you to give it a shot, and please share it. Please get the word out, and look for our polls.
Yeah, I've really I just discovered the podcast a couple weeks ago, and so I haven't listened to too many episodes, but they're really engaging. They're not that long. They're usually about 20 to 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And usually just focused in on one or two major topics that happen to be on your dad's mind. So thanks for coming on again. Maybe, hopefully, we can have you back on maybe sometime in the future. Talk about further things that have happened in the world, or
I would say not maybe, for sure.
okay.
Have me back on. Let's see what happens with a give it a month or two and see what happens. We're going to have a lot happening over these next couple months. So
Yeah, this is a tumultuous time in history, not just for the country, but I think for the world.
you're spot on.
And there's going to be a lot to talk about the next year, then the next few years.
Darren, thanks so much for having me. I'm game to come on whenever.
Okay, thanks again.
Have a good one. Take care.